You wanted more FSX tutorials, and you got more FSX tutorials. Introducing the Airbus A320 by Aerosoft. This is seriously one of the best buys you can make after getting FSX. This airplane is fully loaded with pretty much every feature you could want from a paid add-on. On top of that, the Airbus is especially fun to fly since it has enough fancy doodads to let the plane pretty much fly itself, which is exactly what I'm going to show you how to do today. Let's get this puppy turned on in the air and landed almost entirely by using just the flight computer. Out of the gate, your airplane will likely load already turned on. If you want to skip ever learning how to turn on the airplane, you're good to go. But if you want to be slightly more realistic, you can change the load state in your airplane by going to your co-pilot's FMC. This FMC is where you can tweak all the features of the airplane. Just click on Aircraft State and select Cold and Dark if you want to follow along with the tutorial. You can also select the default state if you want to automatically load into it in the future. The first thing you want to do is switch on the batteries. I also usually activate the external power switch since we're currently parked at the gate. Totally optional, just remember to switch it off before you taxi. Once you have that switched on, you'll see the power has already reached your cockpit. At this point, I like to turn up the brightness on the flight displays so that we have something to look at. Do that by using the scroll wheel on your mouse to move the knobs. Next, we need to get the IR into alignment so we can program our FMC. This takes 5 minutes to do, so I like to start it immediately. Right-click on these three knobs to get that started. What's IR, you ask? Beats the crap out of me. I'm pretty sure it has something to do with GPS and instrument calibration, as your primary flight display is pretty much useless before they're aligned. You'll see your flight displays turn on after you switch them over. As much as we'd like the airplane to be fueled by magic, it actually needs fuel, so we need to turn on the fuel pumps. Toggle these 6 switches in the middle here to make sure they're on. Immediately following that, I also turn on the hydraulic pump switch. That's the button to the top right underneath Engine 2's fire indicator. We'll also turn on the APU by hitting the master APU switch and then pressing the start button right under it. This will let us turn on our engines later. Once the APU is finished spinning up, we'll turn on APU bleed. This knob on the dash is the barometric reference. It has 2 modes. The default one is the European standard. I move it over to the US standard. Feel free to switch on the lights as you please, as well as the interior emergency lights, seatbelt, and no smoking signs. In the middle of your cockpit is your radio. You have to switch it on if you're going to be using it for flight. On the right side of the console is where you set the radio modes. I don't use this very much, but you can move the knob on the right to TARA, which I believe is transmit and receive, and the bottom left switch to ABV, which I honestly have no clue what it does. But the checklist asks it to be set this way. Oh, that reminds me. This plane comes with a checklist feature in the same place you set the aircraft state. You can turn on a co-pilot feature there too, which will have the computer talk you through and then automatically set the items needed to complete the checklist. It's a good way to learn the aircraft. Don't forget to set the parking brake. Now back to the right flight computer. We can click the load button and start to fill up the aircraft. You'll also figure out how the input on these FMCs work if you've never worked with them before. Basically anything you type will be put in the bottom left of the screen. Then you select the area you want to input the entry into. So in this case, I entered 178 for the passenger count, and then click the button next to PAX to put that entry in there. I did the same for fuel, then click Start Boarding and Load Fuel to begin the process. If you're impatient, the developers put a Load Instant button there that skips the realistic loading times. Once the IR is aligned, we can set up our main flight computer with a simple flight plan. Again, we're going for simplicity here. We're flying from Houston Hobby to Dallas Fort Worth. You can click on the right black bar to pop up the FMC window. You can also click the left black bar to enable keyboard input so you don't have to hunt and peck on the computer itself. Don't forget to on-click that once you're done typing, otherwise any keyboard button you hit will continue to send stuff to it when you least expect it. Click the Init button to get to the Init page. In the From To field, we're going to enter the airport identifiers from where we're flying from and to, so KHOU and KDFW. This next page checks for any saved flight plans. You can safely hit Return. Next, click Align IRS. Then you can type in your flight number. The cost index is something airliners use to figure out how much their flight will cost. That's not important to me, so I just put 50 in there. Then you put your cruise flight level, in this case 240, as it's a quick flight. Once that's done, you can click on the perf page. The only item we really care about here is the flaps one. This lets the plane calculate its V-speeds. If you don't know what to put in there, it's pretty safe to put them at just 1/up 0.8. This means you'll be taking off with the flaps set to 1 and with your trim set to 0.8. Now comes the fun part. Click the FPLN button and be greeted with the almighty flight plan screen. This is where almost all new pilots get frustrated and give up, but if you've done everything up to this point, this is actually pretty easy. If you're a sucker for realism, then you should go look up an actual flight plan to try and copy and put in here. Let me know if you want a tutorial for how I would do that. For this simple tutorial though, we're just going to pick some stuff to get us off the ground and landed, even if it's not the most accurate way to fly the path. Select the button for Departure Airport, and then select Departure. Oh, this is a fun feature too. These arrows here help you select through items on the screen, but if you thought up would go up and down would go down, no, that's too much to ask for our friends over at Airbus. The up arrow scrolls the page down, and the down arrow will scroll the page up. I wish I knew why, I really do. We're going to pick the runway we're going to depart from, in this case 30 left. Then we're going to select a SID, or Standard Instrument Departure. This is a set path aircraft to use when leaving an airport. For now, just pick one. They'll all get you off the ground. Selecting a transition is optional. Once you're done, hit the temporary flight plan button to go back to the previous screen. Now you'll see a lot of items in yellow. This means it has not been saved or loaded into the computer yet. You'll also see our first disco, or flight plan discontinuity. We want to resolve all the discos before we begin our flight. For now, select the arrival airport, then arrival. Similar thing here. You want to pick the runway you want to land at. Knowing what direction the runways are in is a bonus here, and you can find that out in the FSX map if you're curious. We want to select a runway with an ILS approach, in this case 36 left. Now we get to select our star, or standard arrival something. This is the path the aircraft take when approaching the runway you selected. Again, knowing what best lines up with your direction is helpful here. But for now, just select one, and I'll show you how to go through your flight plan and edit it as needed. Once done, select Temporary Insert, which will save and apply the flight plan. Now we want to fix these discos. To delete something in your flight plan, you need to select the Clear button, and then press what you want to delete. In this case, we want to delete anything that says Manual and the following disco. Now we want to check and see if our flight plan makes any amount of sense. To do that, you can look at your secondary flight display and move your rose indicator to Plan. I also changed the range of the map with the knob on the right. Now when you scroll through your FMC, it will show it on the map. So go ahead and scroll through and see if anything crazy is going on. In this case, we see that the approach I have loaded seems to go north of the runway and then turns back south. This didn't make any sense, so I deleted those waypoints using the Clear button we used earlier, making sure to clean up any discos along the way. You'll see the FMC update its course as you do this. I ended up selecting a new approach altogether, but I could have made it work as is. Once you're done, move your rose back to ARC so it follows the aircraft. Now for the fun stuff. You can go to the second FMC and remove the traffic cones and wheel chokes. Now we can move the engine state knob to Ignition Start, and flip up the engine we want to start. Once it's on, we'll do the same for the second engine. Move the knob back to normal once you're done. Now you can turn off the APU if you want, but most aircraft leave it on until takeoff is complete in case you have to turn on an engine after takeoff. We can turn off external power though now, and disconnect it from ground services. We can also close the aircraft doors now too, which we honestly should have done before starting the engines. Oops. The dash has our autopilot controls, which we can now set up. If you left click or push on these buttons, it gives control to the aircraft's FMC. If you right click or pull the buttons, it lets you control the setting to whatever you indicate. Think of it as pushing control to the aircraft or pulling control back to you. Push in all the buttons and set the altitude to our cruise speed. Now we need to set our trim to what we programmed in the FMC, which is 0.8 up. To do this, we just click 8 times on the trim wheel. Arm the spoilers, set flaps to 1. Now we taxi to the runway we selected. If you look at the throttle, you'll notice it has a couple of marks on it. There's a CL, FLX, and Toga. Those are detents, or modes you put the aircraft into for its auto throttle to function correctly. For takeoff, we'll put it into toga, then immediately after we'll move it back into climb. You'll hear a click every time it hits a detent. We'll be in climb for the entire flight, right until we're on the other runway. To take off, hit full throttle. Rotate once you hit the speed the computer told us earlier on the perf page in our FMC. And once you have positive climb rate, pull up your landing gear, followed by your flaps a few thousand feet later. After taking off, activate autopilot by clicking the AP1 button on the dash, and move your throttle to the climb detent so the Airbus will control the climb speed. Now the airplane will basically fly itself. You'll see hockey stick indicators on your FMC when the plane sees itself finishing either climbing or descending. It will also indicate where it suggests you start your descent. Rather handy. Once above 20,000 feet, your aircraft will start to tell you to move your baro reference to standard. Do that by pulling on your baro reference knob. Once you start to descend, you'll want to lower your altitude manually. You can look at your FMC to see where it suggests your altitude be at each waypoint. In this case, my next waypoint is CQY. My FMC tells me I should be around 17,000 feet by then, descending to 11,000 after. So I set my altitude to 11,000 and push the button to get the descent started. Now I just keep up with this during the descent. While you're descending, the Airbus will do its best to descend economically by setting the engines to idle and adjusting its descent rate to keep the airspeed up. You don't need to move the throttle. I know it's tempting. Don't touch it, don't do it. You'll also notice some waypoints have a set speed limit. The Airbus will automatically lower its speed when it's necessary. Once below 20,000 feet, you want to set your baro out of standard. Push the button, then hit the B key on your keyboard to set the local baro. Something to note, if you set your altitude below what's in the FMC and push the button, you won't get a dot indicating that the computer is executing on it. What's happening is the altitude you've entered is lower than what is currently in the FMC. Once the airplane hits the waypoint where it needs to descend more, the dot will appear again and you'll descend. Eventually you'll see a D indicated on your map. This is the point at which the aircraft should begin to decelerate. Again, the Airbus should do this all on its own, but this is where you may need to start deploying your flaps for landing or perhaps your air brakes if needed. Once you start getting close to your arrival, probably around 3,000 feet altitude or so, you can click the LS button, which brings up our ILS landing indicators on our primary flight computer. This is the first step in getting the Airbus to auto land. Once on your final approach, turn on Autopilot 2 and click the APPR button. You can probably lower your landing gear and the rest of your flaps at this point too. Now, the aircraft should line itself up and descend into a perfect landing. Make sure your auto brakes are set to low or medium and your spoilers are armed. Don't touch that throttle. Don't do it. If you can restrain yourself, the aircraft will perform a perfect landing. Eventually, you'll hear the aircraft shout out altitudes to you. Once it says retard, you can retard your thrust by pulling the throttle all the way back to idle. Now the aircraft should stop itself on the runway. Hope this was helpful. Like this video if you liked it. Dislike this video if you think my mom is so fat she needs an Airbus to get to work. Comment if you have something more complicated to say. See ya.